This morning, the world woke up to a scene nobody expected. In a hall filled with the most powerful leaders on the planet, presidents, billionaires, tech giants, it wasn't the usual voices that shook the room. It was a young African president, barely in his 30s, who stood up and said what so many have been too afraid to say for decades. His name? Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso. He didn't arrive dressed in the polished suits and shiny shoes that filled the hall. No, he came in his military uniform, steady, calm, unshaken. Around him, chandeliers sparkled above marble floors worth more than some entire villages. The air was heavy with money, with power, with expectation. But Traoré wasn't there to smile or to network. He was there to speak truth, no matter the cost. The stage lights dimmed. The first speaker of the summit walked out, Donald Trump. With his trademark confidence, he scanned the room and, in that familiar voice, dropped words that cut deep. "When you look at Africa," he said, "you see nothing but chaos, corruption, a disaster." The laughter was nervous. Some leaders shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded, unsure whether they agreed or simply feared being seen disagreeing. Cameras flashed. The Golden Hall suddenly felt cold. But one man didn't move. Ibrahim Traoré. Slowly he rose to his feet. The sound of his boots echoed across the polished floor. Heads turned, security stiffened, journalists reached for their pens. Every step he took down that central aisle carried a weight far heavier than steel, the weight of history, of silence breaking, of dignity demanding to be heard. He stopped at the front. No fuss, no theatrics, just a steady gaze locked on. Trump. And then, in a voice clear and firm, he said, "Mr. Trump, with all due respect, you have no idea what Africa truly is." The hall froze. Hearts skipped. Phones went up. The control room lit red, recording in progress. Traoré wasn't shouting. He wasn't even angry. But the power of his words cut sharper than any insult. For the first time in that glittering hall, it wasn't wealth or status commanding attention. It was truth. The young president stood there, his flag pinned proudly to his chest, not just as one man, but as the voice of millions who had been dismissed, ignored, or silenced. And in that moment, the room changed. What began as another staged summit of polite speeches and empty promises had just become history. The air in that grand hall had changed. It was no longer thick with protocol or staged diplomacy. It carried something raw, something undeniable. Truth. Traoré took one small step forward, not toward Trump, not toward any single leader, but into the center of the room itself. And suddenly, the stage belonged to him. He began to speak, not with fury, not with the kind of rage that fades when the echo dies. His words were calm, sharp, and clear, the kind of clarity that cuts deeper than shouting ever could. Africa is not chaos. Africa is not corruption. Africa is history. Africa is resilience. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't uncertain. It was the silence of people realizing they were witnessing something that could not be ignored. Traoré had no notes in his hands. He didn't need any. His voice carried the weight of generations. It was as though he wasn't speaking to that hall at all, but through it, to something larger, older, eternal. "When your ancestors arrived on our lands," he said, "they did not find chaos. They found civilizations. They found kingdoms, trade, medicine, wisdom, societies that lived in balance. What followed was not partnership. It was plunder." He paused. The words hung heavy. "You drew borders with no regard for our languages, our tribes, our history. You enslaved generations. And when we finally broke free, the systems we inherited were never built to serve us. They were built to fail." Across the room, faces tightened. Some leaned back, uncomfortable. Others leaned forward, captivated. The polished veneer of diplomacy was cracking, and beneath it lay truths many had tried hard to bury. Yes, Africa has problems, Traoré continued, steady as stone. But ask yourselves, why? He lifted his hand slightly, as if pointing at the hypocrisy suspended in the air. Because your phones work with our minerals, your desserts are sweetened by our cocoa, your cars and factories run on our oil, and yet... Another pause, long enough for the words to sink in. Our children eat once a day, if they're lucky. Our graduates wander the streets with diplomas and no future. Our hospitals go without medicine while our resources line your pockets. Heads dropped. Some leaders exchanged uneasy glances. Not a single voice interrupted him. You call us corrupt, Traoré said slowly. But what do you call the Western corporations that pay bribes to steal our wealth? What do you call the tax havens where billions of African dollars vanish? What do you call the banks that welcome the fortunes of dictators, fortunes drained from our people? Or the silence when wars are fueled by contracts signed in your boardrooms? Even the most seasoned journalists were scribbling furiously, now. Traoré hadn't raised his voice once. He didn't need to. His calm tone carried more weight than 1,000 speeches. He wasn't throwing accusations wildly. He was holding up a mirror, one the world had avoided for too long. And through that mirror, there was no bitterness, no begging, just truth. Truth that didn't ask for pity. Truth that demanded accountability. Beyond those marble walls in cities and villages across Africa, millions would soon hear these words. And they would know this wasn't said in whispers behind closed doors. It was declared in the very heart of global power. Traoré let the silence stretch a moment longer, letting the truth reverberate in every corner of the room. Then his voice softened, not weaker, not pleading, but more intimate, almost like a story shared across a fire. Let me tell you about a boy, he said. A real boy. His name is Malik. He lives in a small village in Burkina Faso. He is 12 years old. The room shifted. A name, a child, not statistics, not headlines, a human being. And just like that, the speech was no longer about politics. It was about people. Malik, just 12 years old, somebody's son, somebody's brother. Before dawn even breaks, while the world still sleeps, Malik wakes. Not to put on a school uniform, not to rush to a classroom. He lifts a cracked plastic container and begins his walk, 10 kilometers barefoot, not for play, not for adventure, but to fetch water for his mother and his little siblings. The hall was frozen. You could have heard a pin drop. Along the way, Malik passes hills that shimmer with gold, mines that sparkle with the kind of wealth that ends up in jewelry shops in Paris, in watches in New York, in bank vaults in Geneva. Gold his family will never touch. Gold his country may never see. Someone in the front row wiped their eyes. Trump sat still, face unreadable. When Malik returns home, he eats, if there is food. Some days a single meal, other days nothing. And when the candle has just enough wax left, he studies, not dreaming of escape, not longing for visas or airplanes. His dream is different. Malik dreams of becoming an engineer, not to leave Africa, but to rebuild it. To dig wells so no child has to walk 10 kilometers like him. To build roads and hospitals so his village can live with dignity. Traoré let the silence breathe. Then his voice, quiet but unshakable, filled the room. The dream of this boy is not a visa. It is not a ticket out. His dream is justice. His dream is dignity. A ripple moved through the hall. Some leaders lowered their gaze. Others stared at Traoré and saw not just a president, but a man carrying the weight of every child like Malik. Even seasoned reporters trained to stay, detached, faltered. One woman lowered her pen. Another raised her glasses, not to clean them, but to hide her tears. And still, Traoré stood solid, eyes steady, his voice barely above a murmur, but it carried more force than thunder. "You ask why we are angry," he said. "But the truth is, we are not angry. We are awake. Malik does not need pity. He needs power. He needs opportunity. He needs a world that does not steal his future before he has had the chance to live it." The words didn't just hang in the air. They pressed into the chest of everyone present. This wasn't about Malik alone. It was about millions, children forgotten until they grow up with nothing left to give. In a hall built for handshakes and hollow promises, Traoré had just carved out a truth impossible to look away from. Malik's story hadn't only stirred emotion, it had shaken something much deeper. And Traoré wasn't finished. He had moved the room with pain. Now he would confront it with truth. Turning his gaze directly toward the leaders before him, he spoke, not as a politician begging for aid, but as a man holding up a mirror. "You speak of corruption," he began. "You throw that word at us as if it belongs to you, but you are the ones who built it." A stir moved through the audience. Some shifted in their seats, others froze. "Corruption is not born in dusty villages," he continued. "It is protected in your banks. It is written into your contracts. It hides in the tax havens you created." Advisors whispered nervously to one another. Traoré's voice never wavered. "The money stolen from Africa does not stay in Africa. It is in your cities, under your lights, in your glass towers. Corruption does not begin with a miner or a street trader. It begins in your boardrooms, in your deals, in the silence of your governments." He raised his hand, almost gently, as though pulling back the final curtain. "Right now, as I stand here, children in Burkina Faso dig for gold with their bare hands. That gold will never build their schools. It will never buy them medicine. It will line the pockets of men here in Geneva. Malik passes those mines every day. His father died in one of them, buried alive when the shaft collapsed. No report, no justice. He was working for a foreign company that packed up and disappeared. The hall was no longer marble and chandeliers. It was heavy, almost suffocating, with the weight of words that no one could deny. His voice dropped lower now, heavy like stone, each word carrying centuries of weight. "Africa has never been allowed to succeed." The sentence lingered, hanging in the air like thunder that refuses to fade. No one dared to breathe. Around the hall, leaders stared at the young man in uniform, their polished speeches and talking points suddenly meaningless. "We don't ask for permission," he said, his eyes sweeping the room. "Africa is ready to rise, and I, Ibrahim Traoré, will be the first to stand." For a heartbeat, silence ruled. Then, a single clap. Another, and then the wave came. The hall erupted. Latin American presidents were the first to rise, eyes lit with something more powerful than respect. Asian ministers followed, hands lifted in applause. Even among the European delegation, hesitant, stiff, some stood slowly, as if realizing they had just witnessed not a speech but a turning point. The ovation rolled like thunder, unstoppable. Cameras flashed, journalists scribbled until their hands cramped. The marble hall shook with applause, with history being made in real time. And outside those walls, the world was already catching fire. Within minutes, clips of Traoré's words flooded social media. A single phrase, "Africa has never been allowed to succeed," spread like lightning. First in Nairobi, then Johannesburg, then Lagos. Within an hour, it was on screens in Sao Paulo, London, and New York. The hashtag #Traoré Speaks Truth trended across continents. In Ghana, a political science lecture paused as the professor projected the speech onto a whiteboard. Students watched in stunned silence. In Nigeria, a rapper dropped a freestyle that same night, building his chorus around Traoré's final declaration, "We will rise." In Kenya, a school teacher printed the entire transcript and handed it to her students. This, she told them, is what courage looks like. In Senegal, an artist painted through the night, a mural of Traoré standing tall, surrounded not by soldiers with guns, but by children holding books and tools. Above them, 3 words stretched across the wall: "Do not wait." Even outside Africa, the reaction was electric. Headlines shifted in real time. Traoré challenges Trump, wins global respect, from military jacket to global symbol. Young leader of Burkina Faso sparks a movement. Activists quoted him, scholars analyzed him, influencers who had never once spoken about Africa suddenly invoked his name. And ordinary people, millions of them, shared the clips, commented, argued, cried, and hoped. A president from a country most headlines ignore had stepped into the center of the world stage and changed the conversation forever. They thought it would be just another summit speech. A young African president standing at the podium, delivering polite words that would be forgotten the next day. But when Captain Ibrahim Traoré spoke, the world stopped scrolling. His words cut through the noise, sharp, direct, unforgettable. For the first time in years, people weren't just hearing Africa, they were listening. Back home in Burkina Faso, the reaction was electric. In Ouagadougou, thousands poured into the streets. Flags waved, phones replayed the speech on loop, murals of his face appeared overnight, and T-shirts with the slogan, "Traoré tells the truth," sold out in hours. Kids were reciting his lines in schoolyards, radio stations slipped his quotes between songs, and elders spoke his name with pride. One man called a radio station and said, "He didn't just speak for himself, he spoke for my son, for Malik, for all of us." But the movement didn't end with applause. A week later, Traoré stood before his nation and announced a new vision: Africa first. It wasn't a slogan, it was a plan. Keep Africa's resources in African hands, end the exploitative contracts with foreign corporations, launch scholarships, startup funds, and youth empowerment projects. Hunt down stolen wealth hidden offshore and bring it back home. Suddenly, the ripples spread. Ghana, Ethiopia, Tanzania, even oil-rich Nigeria sent delegations to Burkina Faso, not to offer charity, but to join forces. At a regional summit, one leader stood up and declared, "We are not poor. We are nations whose wealth was stolen. Now it's time we take it back." For the first time, Africa wasn't asking to be rescued. It was standing tall, charting its own course. And at the center of it all was Traoré, once dismissed as a populist, now called a visionary. A young woman in Dakar wrote, "He is the African lion, not because he roars but because he protects." Yet the real test wasn't the speech in Geneva or the headlines that followed. It was what happened when the cameras turned away. Traoré returned home, not to applause, but to a broken system that still needed rebuilding, and that's where leadership began. The Africa First plan moved from words to action. New mining laws gave priority to local ownership. Anti-corruption reforms held even his closest allies accountable. National youth programs funded startups, trained engineers, and expanded scholarships for students like Malik, who still studied by candlelight. And it didn't stop at Burkina Faso. Across the continent, governments began revisiting their own contracts, inspired by his courage. Leaders who once whispered their frustrations about foreign control started speaking openly. And, more importantly, taking action. What changed wasn't just policy, it was belief. Belief that Africa didn't need to copy anyone. Belief that it didn't need permission. Belief that its future had always belonged to its own people. He never stood before the world claiming to be Africa's savior. What he offered was something far more powerful. A spark. A question. A challenge that every young African would need to answer in their own way. "I cannot fix Africa alone," he reminded people in his speeches. No leader can, but I can carry the torch long enough to hand it to you. And that torch did not fall to the ground. It spread. From crowded cities to dusty villages, from classrooms to marketplaces, people stopped waiting for permission. They organized, they built, they challenged, they dreamed. The change wasn't sudden, but it was real. A continent that once whispered now spoke with confidence. The world wasn't sure whether to celebrate or brace itself, but one thing was undeniable. Africa was no longer asking. Africa was moving, with clarity, with dignity, and with its eyes wide open. And for the first time in a long time, the world was listening. Friends, this story is just one piece of a larger journey. If you want to walk with us as Africa rises, if you want to hear the truth when it speaks, stay with this channel. Every story we tell is a reminder that history is still being written right now. So, if you believe in this vision, let us know in the comments. Share this with someone who needs hope. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next chapter is already being lived and you deserve to be part of it. Until then, may strength, courage, and clarity guide us all.